Welcome, everyone. It's my great pleasure to welcome you today to Park Pride's Roundtable. Our topic today is outdoor play in times of crisis. This is part of Park Pride's larger offerings of virtual programs this year that have included our June Roundtable on Nature for All and our Parks and Green Space Conference with our focus on the nature of our city on August 17th. This year, we've done a lot to focus on access to nature. You'll notice my Nature for All t-shirt here today. This year, we've really found how critical access to nature is. Many people have connected with nature in their backyards and their neighborhood parks. Many have ventured to some of the great nature spots that we have within our city and in our region. This has been part of our collective resilience as we've made it through this difficult time of social isolation. At Park Pride, we believe every Atlantan needs and deserves access to nature. This is an equity issue. It's also a public health issue. Researcher Ming Kuo draws a parallel between changes in zoo habitats of yesterday and today. Many of us today remember Zoo Atlanta's famous silverback gorilla, Willie B., who used to sit in his cell and watch TV. Zoo Atlanta flipped the script on this narrative as they released Willie B into the wild in a habitat that approximated his natural habitat. This wasn't just done for the viewing public. It was done for the health and longevity of Atlanta's silverback gorilla population. As Ming Kuo puts it, human beings are hardwired for nature. We have an innate need for access to nature. Failure to meet this need results in physical, social, and psychological impacts. Yet many Atlantans live in environments that are disconnected from nature, and this is a public health issue. In a similar way, play is a need. As we will hear from our speaker in just a minute, many believe it is a basic human right. And this basic human right is being marginalized and diminished in times of crisis. Which brings me to today's topic, outdoor play in times of crisis, and which is the focus of today's roundtable. Before we get started, let's move on to the next slide. I'd like to share the agenda and a few housekeeping items. We're going to start off with our featured presentation by Theresa Casey, which we'll be getting into in just a minute. From there, we'll go into a series of Q&A, beginning with some questions that I'll start off with, and then opening it up to the audience. From there, we'll close with 30 minutes of optional breakout sessions. We found that this was a great option during our conference to give people a chance to process what they've just heard and to bring it close to home. So that's the run of show for today. We will be sending around a short satisfaction survey following the program. We'd love your feedback, and that'll be helpful for us as we look to continue to engage with virtual programming in the coming year. Next slide. Before we dive into the program, I want to take a moment to recognize Park Pride's corporate champions. These are the companies that believe in the power of parks and nature and make this work possible. They believe and understand the fact that parks and green space are critical infrastructure. And as we're dealing with the issues of the pandemic, we need our parks and we need organizations like Park Pride. Park Pride's able to offer this roundtable free and open to the public thanks to these generous sponsors. If you'll go on to the next slide, I want to recognize yet another round of our corporate champions. Thanks to all of our sponsors. I know that many of you are watching today, and I want you to know how much we appreciate your support and sticking with us during this tough time. If there's anybody on the phone or on the call today that would like to be a sponsor, please reach out to me personally or to Chad Nash at chad@parkpride.org, and we'd be happy to bring you on board, helping to support the great work of Park Pride and programs like this. Next, I do want to highlight next year's conference. We do have a theme. The theme is the new case for parks, and we're really looking at the triple threat, the issues that have been going on with COVID-19, but also the elevation of issues of institutional racism that was brought to light with the senseless killing of George Floyd and others. And I think there is a critical moment here that coalesces with this public health issue, as well as the economics, to say, what is the new case for parks? And certainly a part of that is looking at equitable access, but also, as I alluded to with access to nature, it's about how we use parks differently. So I would encourage you to save the date. The date is May 4th. May the 4th be with you. And I hope you will spend May 4th with us as we elevate the new case for parks. I also want to highlight some other events that are coming up. We have our big park meeting, and this is something in particular for our friends of the park groups. It's a Saturday session for 2 hours where we'll be digging deep with groups to share best practices and ways to engage with communities at the local level. It's going to be a great program. I'm very excited about all of our different speakers and content experts. So if you're looking to figure out how to maintain your efforts to support your local park, to learn how to get the most out of your relationship with Park Pride, please join us for that. We have also our next park meeting that is December 10th, and our Park Pride Roundtable next year, February 2021. So lots of exciting opportunities to keep the momentum and to continue to engage with Park Pride. Next slide. I did want to invite you today that as we're having this conversation, to invite you to make use of the chat function. This is something that we use to great effect at our Parks and Green Space Conference. There are 3 options for chat: event, stage, and direct messages. For today's conversation, it will take place in the stage chat, so you should use that area to have the conversation. I'd also encourage you to submit questions that you have to Teresa at any time. Our staff are monitoring the chat, and we'll be bringing those into the Q&A as we move forward. So again, in the area and joining the conversation, pay attention to the stage tab in the chat function. So please keep your questions coming, and let's make this an interactive opportunity to engage with your fellow attendees and with Teresa as our featured speaker. At this point, I would like to move right into introducing Teresa. She's joining us here today from Scotland, and it's really great with this virtual program that it has shrunk our world and allowed us to bring someone of Teresa's caliber to the Park Pride audience. Teresa is an independent play consultant and writer with special interests in inclusion, environments for play, and children's rights. Her career has spanned adventure play opportunities for children and young people with additional support needs in Scotland, developing play projects for children in disadvantaged communities in Thailand, and supporting inclusion through play in schools and networks in community settings. Teresa is a fellow of the Winston Churchill Memorial Trust, and her work has been recognized through a number of national and international awards. Teresa served as president of the International Play Association from 2008 to 2017, where she coordinated initiatives including Access to Play in Crisis, Under the Same Sky, Children's Rights in the Environment, and the IPA's work with the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Teresa to the stage. Welcome, Teresa.
Hi, Michael. It's great to be here this afternoon.
We're so excited to have you, and it's such a pleasure to be here with you today. I was wondering if we could take a moment and just recognize kind of the different experiences with COVID here and across the pond, as they say. Here, we're really facing a situation of no relief in sight, where we're seeing cases going up. Tell us about what's going on in your neck of the woods and how COVID is playing out where you are.
Yes, indeed. I mean, it's obviously a very difficult time for people. And here also the number of cases is rising. We had a period of relative calm where it felt as if perhaps things were a little bit more under control. Businesses started reopening, the children are back at school, activities are starting up again. But unfortunately now, all of a sudden, we're starting to feel quite nervous again. We're definitely seeing with the children a sort of sense of anxiety that they're picking up from the people around them, whether that's in school or families, and a little bit of nervousness about tighter restrictions ahead. And one thing I've particularly noticed, actually, even just in the last few days, is the impact of the seasons. So our clocks changed last weekend, so it's a bit darker at night. The days are a bit shorter. It's Halloween this weekend, and the children are being told they're not allowed to go out guising, we call it, which I think is similar to your trick-or-treating. And people feel a bit worried about that, starting to feel that there might be a long, dark winter ahead, and that's quite scary. So I think it really sort of points up to that sense of nervousness and how we're all going to cope.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. I also want to recognize you're joining us with a 4-hour time lag, so you'll be heading into the weekend shortly after this call. I do appreciate you taking the time today. Before we, and I think at this point we can call up the presentation, and I will step back. Before I do want to recognize Cynthia Gentry, who was our shared friend who introduced us to you. She is someone who I think of in Atlanta as our play guru. And she's someone that's helped me to understand child-directed play and the importance of play within child development. I know we're going to get into that today, but part of the whole reason for you to be here today is the idea that in this time of crisis, oftentimes health concerns focus on the immediate issues of the pandemic. But the need for play and the right to play, I think, is something that we're starting to talk about more in Atlanta as we look at things like our Parks and Recreation plan and looking at how we're planning for play and making Atlanta a playful city. So with that, let me just turn it over to you, but also to say, I think there is a contingent here that's trying to carry this conversation beyond you coming in and sharing your thoughts and bringing it to an international level. And Cynthia Gentry is really a great resource and a champion here locally. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Teresa. Thanks so much for being here. We look forward to hearing your remarks.
Thank you very much, Michael. And yes, it is the end of the week for me, so it's great to think that about an hour from now, I'll be done for the week. I can go and put my feet up, but you'll still have the afternoon ahead of you. So I think Marlene is going to bring up my first slide, and I'll just launch off. So first of all, thank you again so much for inviting me to be part of the Park Pride Roundtable. I'm going to be talking, as Michael said, about the importance of play in crisis situations, and especially outdoor play. I hope to bring in as much as possible about what children themselves say about playing, as theirs is often quite an absent voice, and this is especially true, I think, for children growing up in marginalised communities. My presentation draws on work of many colleagues, especially through my time with the International Play Association. So you'll hear me mention IPA and our friend Cynthia. This is where we met, so it's been a lovely partnership to be able to work with her. And it's really about this worldwide community of play advocates. So that's where my background comes from and the learning that I'm trying to share with you today. But also my background as a face-to-face play worker, primarily in adventure playgrounds, traditional adventure playgrounds in Scotland and in Thailand. I think all of these pieces are an expression of solidarity and collaboration for and with children. And again, as Michael mentioned, this is probably, one of the things that we really need to start thinking about in terms of now that we're all affected by this pandemic. I really love to quote the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, and I know that the US isn't a signatory, and maybe I should say not a signatory yet. So sorry, perhaps I shouldn't have brought it up quite so soon. But the right to play is embedded in the landscape of human rights, intrinsically tied to other conventions and treaties. For example, the Convention on the Rights of Disabled People, it's been talked about by the Human Rights Council, and all these mechanisms. So the Convention on the Rights of the Child is a cornerstone really of understanding play as a right. Finally, before I move on to the first slide, I haven't put many references into my presentation, but you'll find most of this work at ipaworld.org, so I'm sure you can explore there to find more of it. Next slide, please. So first, as Michael said, I'm joining you from Scotland. I live outside the city of Edinburgh, near to John Muir Country Park. That's me with my kids and my husband. That, believe it or not, is in the spring, even though it looks quite chilly with our hoods up. And we spent a lot of time in John Muir Country Park. It's obviously named for the famous naturalist John Muir, who was born just down the road from here in the town called Dunbar, and famously known as the father of national parks in America. So I just wanted to shamelessly curry favour with you in pointing out that connection. John Muir said some fabulous things about his experiences in nature and the wilderness. including this: in every walk with nature, one receives far more than one seeks. And that has certainly felt true over the last months, especially during the months of strictest lockdown. My family have never been more grateful to live in beautiful open spaces, with these open spaces nearby, for walking, for playing, for growing, for stopping to read, to draw, to have a picnic. And we were often in John Muir Country Park for our hour of exercise that was allowed each day. If we ever doubted the value of open space, parks, whether small or large, this crisis has definitely reminded us of the vital role of green spaces close to home. The most important outdoor spaces weren't the fancy attraction parks, but the local space you could go to often and find new things in each time. We were very aware of the phenomena of people starting to notice nature again. The birds seemed to sing louder, the sunsets were more lovely, the water sparkled more brightly. Next slide. One day down at the river, we saw candy stripes of blue and pink in the water reflected from the sky, and it looked to us like a baby blanket. And yet here we all are in the midst of a crisis, a pandemic. We certainly felt like a crisis. Life wasn't the same, and there's a sense of danger lurking around the corner, just out of sight. Our confidence about what we feel we know and can rely on is undermined. It affects everyone, of course, but not everybody in the same way. For some people, this crisis has created some welcome relief and calm, while for others, it was obvious the crisis was magnifying aspects of existing inequalities. And for children, access to play in parks and green spaces in their everyday lives is one of those dimensions. Next slide, please. The International Play Association over the last 8 years or so has developed a focus on how children access play in crisis situations. We had searched the literature and no one had properly looked at this. There was some work around play as therapy or providing play to keep children occupied while something more important was happening in the eyes of adults. But before focusing on play in crisis, I think we really need to think simply about why playing is important to children. And we always do this when we work on this topic because we only know why it's important in crisis if we recognise it as critical in children's everyday lives. So this picture here is a visual note from one of our early meetings with representatives from organisations working with play in various countries: Thailand, Lebanon, Turkey, Nepal, India, the UK and Japan. And we talked and shared memories of play in our own countries and cultures, and we took this little note as we went along. It seems really remarkable how recognisable different play memories were. And perhaps you might recognise some of them too, and you could perhaps even add some of your memories of play from when you were a child into the chat box as we speak, if you'd like to. So, for example, here in the picture on the right, I can see friends in Thailand and Syria who both remembered making corn dolls from stalks from the fields. There was lots of discussion about how time felt endless when you were playing, and memories that you stayed out playing for hours and hours until called back by parents. Play could be active, it was funny, you played in the trees, or you simply daydreamed. And most of the time, memories were outdoors. Few of the memories involved adults, though some had a special person, such as, I think if you can see down in the right-hand corner, this fun uncle who children used as a den for hide and seek. Most of all, people seem to remember joy, fun, friendship, and feelings of happiness when they played. Next slide, please. These are all characteristics most children would consider the important ones. And when we formally try to describe play, the characteristics that are most accepted are fun, uncertainty, challenge, flexibility, and non-productivity. And I think this is the foundational idea. Play is a common drive, one of the things that makes us most human. It's why playing is recognised as a right in the Convention of the Rights of the Child. And it's these characteristics together that are said to contribute to the enjoyment that playing produces and the consequent incentive to continue playing. So as the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child have said, play is fundamental and vital dimension of the pleasure of childhood an essential component of physical, social, cognitive, emotional, and spiritual development. And I have to say, I really love this quote because it puts the pleasure of childhood before the instrumental benefits of play. So how important it is that our children enjoy their childhood. And in these times, that seems to me that's something we have to be very conscious of. What are the memories children are storing up at the moment of play and their childhood years, because you don't get them back. Next slide, please. Or as the children have said, playing helps us to stay happy, safe, and healthy. Next slide. So coming back to crisis situations and play in crisis, one of the group that IPA worked with was particularly influential to all of our thinking. Her name is Maria, and she certainly influenced my thinking enormously. She worked with us in IPA when we were working with the UN Children's Committee to develop the landmark statement and guidance on children's play rights, which you can find on the UN Committee's website. Maria invited me and a colleague to visit her in Lebanon a few years ago, and she took us to informal tented settlements which had become home to children and families who had fled over the mountains from Syria. So obviously this is not a good situation for children and families to be in, everything left behind, infrastructure gone, people missing, families feeling very vulnerable. And this was near the beginning of IPA's work on play in crisis. I remember Maria saying to us, the children need to play, play, play. And I just want to reflect on why did she say that? Next slide, please. Our work drew on the lived experience of children in different parts of the world, hopefully giving voice to their perspectives. So Maria introduced us to Syrian children and families that she worked with who either lived in an informal tented settlements or shelters. Many of the participating children were out of school, some were child labourers, while others attended formal or non-formal education programmes and came to the Beyond centres. Many of the children expressed their thoughts about the crisis through playing. There was definite preoccupation with scenes of war. The children knew more details about bombs and destruction than you would want children to know. And they certainly felt the pain of displacement, being lost and away from home and losing friends or relatives and family. So children were very much affected by the crisis and described it as something horrible and terrifying. And there were real barriers to children's play in their current situation. So garbage in the environment, fear of fights and weapons, strangers who made them feel unsafe, large vehicles that made it hard for them to move around safely, pests and animals in open fields, maybe risky sites next to rivers or the sea, and social constraints on girls in particular playing outdoors. So there were very many real dangers. Although I do wonder if you recognise any of these as well. I mean, I certainly do recognise some of these from work here in the UK too. Next slide. However, in the informal tented settlements, children were seen to make use of every single available space for playing, whether it was indoors or outdoors, whatever the conditions. Children played in and between and inside the tents and shelters, in the streets and little alleyways between them, in the areas for parking, in the fields and in the centres of the Beyond Association. And whenever children found an opportunity, they made their own play objects with plastic and paper and clothes, and they made things like kites and puppets. And they could name lots of games they played together, like football and hide and seek and racing, or games that could be played alone, such as puzzle games and playing with dolls, puppets and modelling clay. So they had a really rich and wide repertoire of play. The children said they dreamed of having lots of materials such as ropes, balls, puzzles, swings, toys, crayons and colouring paper. And they dreamed of a place that was full of friends, safe, large, clean and healthy. They wanted a playground with green meadows, without dangerous animals, without rocky stones, without fear of strangers and kidnapping. For them, an ideal place for playing is a place that's always open to welcome them, whatever the conditions outside. Next slide, please. So it's possible from listening to children and observing their play, from understanding it from their point of view and talking to children in different contexts, to suggest some of the ways that play is beneficial to children experiencing crisis. To think about why it's considered to have therapeutic and restorative qualities. There's lots of reasons I could list, from helping children recover a sense of normality and joy after experienced loss and dislocation, or helping children who've experienced bereavement to overcome emotional pain and have a sense of control again over their lives, to restore a sense of identity and to help themselves make meaning out of what's happened to them. It certainly offers this opportunity for fun and enjoyment, and for children to engage in a shared experience to rebuild a sense of personal value and worth. So perhaps these are big claims, but children need plentiful opportunities for play, space for play, time for play, resources, and supportive of adults. And this is what enables children's own coping mechanisms and points to the responsibilities that adults have. Next slide, please. These next couple of slides show a few more examples where we found that self-directed and self-determined play can increase children's opportunities to build their own resilience. The IPA local researchers spent loads of time in a community in Calcutta near the river that had also a train track and a crematorium, and the children's play was extraordinarily rich and, to our eyes, hugely risky. For example, making rafts to float out onto the river, and a big river at that. And they had these amazing adventures. Next slide. Or these children in migrant communities in Thailand whose play was very much embedded in storytelling, culture, and the resources around them. So playing with bamboo and floppy sandals and tins to make drums. And we found really fascinating testimony from children about their lives at play, like the ghost stories that they loved to tell and the games they played to terrify themselves and run away squealing. Next slide. But this isn't all about somewhere else, it's here with all of us. So many children face huge barriers in their everyday lives, which mean that they must take their chances to play whenever and wherever they can. It follows then that if children's play is essential for healthy development and well-being, then we should protect children's time to play freely, that children's play spaces are important environments that should be protected and cared for. We need to understand that children's idea of a desirable play space may differ from that of an adult, that adults need to listen to children about playing, and that agencies can support children by recognising the value play brings to children's life experience and share that knowledge with others. Next slide, please. COVID has brought crisis to children all over the world, but we might be in the same boat. But for me, I think that some people are very much closer to the choppy waters than others. So in about May this year, IPA decided to draw on all the experiences in different situations of crisis to put together what we have learned that might help parents and carers to understand the importance of playing, particularly during lockdown at home in their families. And you'll find these resources on the IPA website in different languages, and they distilled what we'd learned from children in situations of acute and chronic crisis. To me, I think we couldn't really have written those otherwise. They ended up being used all over the place, from government information campaigns and websites to education services and NGOs. And one of the things that reinforced for me in writing them is that we do have to listen to children if we want to learn from them and be authentic advocates. Next slide, please. So I wanted to give you an example of that in Scotland that I was involved in as a lead person for children's play. It's clear that coronavirus pandemic and government responses to it have a huge impact on children's human rights. And there is a principle that for governments to comply with their obligations in international law, and in our case here in Scots law, they should assess the impact on children of decisions they make before making them. So the Children's Commissioner here, that's an independent office that holds government and public bodies to account, felt that there hadn't been enough work done around that. So they conducted what they called an independent children's rights impact assessment, which is a thorough analysis of how, in this case, the laws and policies around COVID impacted on the human rights of children and young people here. It was the biggest children's rights impact assessment in the world in this time and covered a whole range of aspects of children's lives, far far too much to go into here. I wanted to highlight a few things, and then you can find the whole document online. So, of course, the coronavirus pandemic measures are undertaken by governments to protect life. The longer term health of children and young people is also at risk, and there are multiple harms as a result of play deprivation, which I'm going to come on to. So there may have been some benefits to some children, or children who coped well. For example, there's been lots and lots of new opportunities online created for and with children, and some of them are really of positive benefit and often quite inclusive. But while some children might have coped well, studies are definitely showing that many children have experienced considerable trauma, loss and hardship. Next slide. COVID resulted in significant and sudden change in conditions for children and young people to play and participate in recreational, cultural and artistic activities. Despite the tendency to view access to play as amounting to opportunities for activities, for me it's really about autonomy and freedom. There's been a dramatic impact resulting in feeling of powerlessness, loss of control, and certainly exacerbated by restrictions on social, leisure and learning opportunities. I wanted to give you a little example from my home. So that's my little boy sitting there in the sand, but he's obviously only about 2 or 3 at that point, and he's now 14, so he's a teenager, and he's about 5'9", so he towers above me. And you know how they say that behaviour is always a form of communication? Well, I certainly discovered that because my little boy of 5'9" and 14 really started to behave like a toddler again during lockdown. And his main thing was that he kept on saying no to everything. Everything was suggested, he said no. And then it wasn't until a little bit into this that I realised really that was his only way of exerting any control over any aspect of his life. All the control had been taken away. So of course, play, culture and artistic expression can be enjoyed in the home and online, but it seems to me that culture really derives from the community. So these rights might be said to be most fully articulated, enjoyed in schools, streets, community venues and public spaces, and in festivals, events and ceremonies. And we're losing all of these things at the moment. Next slide. And for adolescents, that has a particular dimension highlighted by the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, that adolescents experience greater expectations surrounding their role in society and more significant peer relationships as they transition from a situation of dependency to one of greater autonomy. And that's one of the reasons why I'm upset when I hear teenagers and young people being criticised so much for not sticking to the rules, because I think it's a particularly difficult ask of them. The measures which restrict access to play rights continue to have really wide-ranging impacts on children, especially groups whose rights need particular attention. And there are intersections of disadvantage and discrimination for children and young people across communities, and they're certainly being highlighted at the moment. These negative impacts are greatest for children from marginalised and disadvantaged groups. The physical, environmental and social restrictions on measures imposed on children and young people are linked directly to children's health, development and well-being. And I think it really would be reasonable to expect that children and young people living in a home without adequate indoor space, or without a garden or access to outside space or a safe open space nearby, or indeed a park, would find things particularly difficult. Next slide. And lastly, on this point, before moving on, children and young people were very involved in this impact assessment process. And I was struck by this remark from Abigail, aged 15, who said, "Life-changing decisions have been made during coronavirus that have felt like playing a game. Every time it should be our turn, someone skips over us and we end up left behind and forgotten." I think it just really points to lack of involvement and consultation with children and young people themselves about what's happening and how we're responding to crisis. And that meaningful participation in decision making really has an impact on well-being and coping. Next slide. So I'm back to outdoor play in my last few slides. I've suggested here that an optimum play environment is flexible, adaptable, varied and interesting. And I wonder if you would agree with that. Perhaps you could put in the chat box what makes a great outdoor play space. We think it might be a trusted space where children feel free to play in their own way, in their own terms, and that children's spaces should include chances for wonder, excitement, and the unexpected, and most importantly of all, are not overly ordered and controlled by adults. These spaces are crucial to children's own culture and for their sense of place and belonging. Growing up with adverse childhood experiences, and this pandemic and all the multiplier events as an example of that, is likely to have a big impact on the physical, mental, and emotional development of children. However, outdoor play can help with the impacts of stress and contribute to long-term improvements in children's outcomes. Next slide. So play must be part of our response. Actions to mitigate the impact of the restrictions on children and young people have not so far, in my experience, taken sufficient notice of the advantages to be gained and the limitation of harms through supporting play, especially outdoors. The measures have often been quite muddled and contradictory in relation to this. But if we agree that play is beneficial during times of anxiety and adversity and supports children's own coping and resilience, that means we need to think about how crisis has affected children's play and the ways that play might mitigate the impact of crisis. We should consider the ability to fight off disease now and in the future, and the ways in which play, especially in green space, can support better mental health, and the manner in which self-directed free play and supported play is connected to wider learning and development. And there's masses of research now coming forward about that. Our government here in Scotland took a while to get round to this, but it did eventually wake up. And in fact, our fully outdoor nurseries were the first to reopen. Next slide, please. The messages, as I say, have started to get out that it's okay to play. And this needs initiatives such as community play rangers in parks, loose parks play, pop-up play. And here, the government funded a lot of this type of activity as the months went on. I think locally it's essential that the world doesn't seem like a frightening place to children. So we do need things like play-friendly signage, we need trusted presence outdoors, and we need to give confidence to play outdoors again. And there's certainly evidence that being outdoors is much safer and has a lower risk than indoor play or activities. And anecdotally here, and again, I'm not sure what you think there, but we've seen our parks being busier than ever. And one of the reasons is that children don't have as many scheduled clubs and activities as have well been shut. So they simply have more free time and so have more time for play. Next slide. So I wanted to finish just with a couple of prompter slides, maybe, of some of the things that we might think about in relation to supporting play going forward. So I've got two slides about this, one about staff and organisations, and we might think about creating and protecting space or time for play and how we do that, making available resources to support play, how we facilitate play now, especially when we still have to maintain safe protocols, building relationships with children and families, developing play opportunities within communities. I like the idea of green spaces close to home, enabling children to contribute to the development of play projects and taking actions to remove barriers to play. Next slide. And that our policymakers could be thinking about providing for children's play from the outset, ensuring that other priorities do not negatively impact on children's access to play, perhaps adopting a play policy. We have a national play policy in Scotland as well as local ones, ensuring that staff who are working with children are supported, and absolutely listening to children. And my last slide, I'd like to finish with some words directly from the recent IPA resources that I mentioned. Playing helps children stay physically and mentally well. It's an everyday part of a healthy and happy childhood. Play is just as important during a crisis like the current coronavirus pandemic. It helps children manage their emotions and maintain a sense that everything is and can be okay. Whether your time outside is on city streets, in a park, in a playground, in the countryside, nature is all around you. So I'd just like to remind you to make the most of the time outdoors, and to thank you very much for giving me this time to speak this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Teresa. That was wonderful.
Oh, thank you. It's been lovely to be able to share with you this afternoon.
Yes, I would like to start off with a couple of questions before we open it up for. I know that folks will be sending questions in the chat, and I'd like to bring forward thoughts that folks have. There's a couple of comments that I wanted to make. Just one of your last slides to talk about the use of signage to kind of give kids permission to have a right to play. Right now, we have signs within all of our parks and along the Beltline. And if there's one message that if I would frame those, it's kind of putting out a message of fear and caution, kind of, social distancing. And I think it's valid to try to make sure that we're changing behavior. But I was struck in hearing the description of play, that the way that play actually gives kids a sense of control, and in some ways is the antidote to that fear, that in some ways we're not sending that message in our efforts to make sure that people are being protective of public health. So I'm curious just if you have thoughts about that in terms of our temporary signage in the public realm, how we both kind of balance those issues of trying to direct people to pay attention to the public health concerns over COVID, but at the same time, what messages we're sending to our young people and our children in ways that we might think about complementing some of those messages with other messages that are kind of reinforcing that this is a place that the play can happen.
Yeah, thanks for noticing that, actually. So that those pieces of signage are have been created locally here to where I am in the local play association that supports play across our county. And our team spent a lot of time thinking about this. So the government, as I mentioned, the Scottish Government put some funding into what they called organised outdoor play. And it was all about encouraging children to get back out into the parks and spaces, because for quite a long time, obviously, we've been saying, stay indoors, don't go out, and the impression that a lot of children are getting is that the world is a scary place. So there are germs and things everywhere, there's dangers everywhere. And we were definitely hearing that, previously we've been encouraging to get children get out, get mucky, get your hands in the dirt, take on risky play,
Right.
tackle the world. And then for a period of time, they were told, don't go out, stay in, everything's very dangerous. So we felt really strongly that, of course, we still have to manage the situation. We still have to keep things as safe as we can. But it's not in anybody's interest to kind of perpetuate that message in children's minds, especially at a time when, this can stay with them for years, this sense of anxiety about the outdoor space. So, for example, we were very careful with the signage about washing your hands, that it's not about generally keeping clean or, not having germs on your hands. It's about only the COVID virus. And I think it's really important to say that, we're not saying, you mustn't touch anything. We'd heard that some children in schools were being told not to play in the sand, but honestly, what are you going to pick up from playing in the sand? So we thought really carefully about it. We really wanted to make sure that it was still friendly, still welcoming. It's saying to children, the world is a wonderful place and you have a part in it, that nature is a great space to be out and playing in. We do need to reinforce some positive rules, but we can do it in a really positive way that doesn't frighten children. So we absolutely did not have red and yellow warning tape and scary messages. It's about just saying that there are some things we can do to keep ourselves safe, but we can do it together in a kind of sense of solidarity. Let's work together and keep things safe. So that's the approach we take. And I haven't seen very much of this type of, we had to make our own because we hadn't seen any. So we would love to see a sharing of play-friendly signage. So if anybody else has some they'd like to share with us, and we can certainly share ours, then we would love to see that, because I think it does make a huge difference.
I think you're right, and I think that's a great point. I also find myself thinking your Lebanon example, and there was also a reference on one of your slides to a loose parts play. And so much of what I can think of growing up, there are people that have mentioned kind of going in storm drains is one area, and the other part was just different ways of assembling different types of things out in the woods. That was but much of my experience. I'm curious if you have thoughts. I know that one area that we may get into with questions with folks is, right now, the guidance that we've seen within the city of Atlanta and other places, the parks are open, but the playgrounds are closed. And yet, initially, there was the yellow tape that was around those different areas, not put up by the city, but as volunteers were trying to keep people off of that equipment. But as this has kind of gone on for a longer period of time, I see mixed activities just in my efforts going around to different parks and things like that. And I think there's a policy question that I would defer more to our government partners on what guidance they want to put out there as the ones who are the kind of the administrators of those parks and that kind of thing. But maybe you could speak a little bit about how play has changed in parks and how there are different types of things that you can do to play in the parks, even if you're not playing on the jungle gym. There's also kind of the sand example, I think, is a really good one. But there are ways that kids might be playing differently in different places that are different from kind of the scrum of kids that were playing on playgrounds before. So again, any thoughts on just how play is changing within our public spaces in light of the pandemic?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that whole issue about play equipment in playgrounds being closed off is really interesting, and there has been a trajectory here around that because they were also closed off here, and now they're all pretty much open again.
Mm-hmm.
And the process of risk benefit assessment, which is a very big part of play sector work here, certainly, and you're nodding too, has been a really important part of that, because it's about really sort of thinking about balancing the risks in a sensible way. And we know that all the evidence can't possibly be there yet. We don't know what all the answers are around transmission of disease and how long viruses can last on equipment and things. But this risk benefit assessment process has been, I think, a really useful way. It's like going back to first principles again, not to go to the scary place immediately, but to go back to first principles and sort of really think it through. So I suppose one element of that is thinking about, the sort of multiple harms that are actually accumulating for children by not playing, but also how long the COVID virus can actually exist on outdoor equipment. So although there's no definitive answers, there are people who are saying that, we need to err on the side of caution, but we also need to curb excesses in terms of shutting everything down. Now, I think that took me off on a slight tangent from your actual question. So loose parks play, I think, has been is something that a tool that we have to support children's play very definitely. Now, in your example of perhaps the woods or streams or fields, it's full of loose parts. So all those things that we can pick up and manipulate and build bridges with, or make a den, or hide behind, all those kind of things are in abundance in natural environments, and we don't really need to introduce many in certain natural spaces. And they can also be in abundance in kind of street places that children really love to play, or places that they're not supposed to play in but like to play if they can. But if we've got more sterile environments, so I don't know about there, but some of our school playgrounds, for example, are quite sterile. Some of our parks are quite sterile. Then introduction of loose parts, so items that children can manipulate and build and play with, can be a really great way just to enable their play process to happen more naturally, and to allow their creativity and imagination to come forward. So, I mean, think as an action that we can take proactively to support a wider and richer repertoire of play, like we saw with those kids in Lebanon or Thailand or India. We can be introducing those elements into our parks and spaces, and we can do that safely as well. I mean, obviously we have to consider the protocols at the moment, but certainly it can be done safely. And it's one of those things that's a bit like a signal or a flag that says it's okay to play. Here's permission to play.
You're reminding me that a couple of years ago, our whole conference was focused on parks and play. And there was a nature and play speaker named Robin Moore, who you may know of, who gave an example of kind of large Lincoln log kinds of things that were in a park that kids could assemble in different places. and that was not the most expensive play amenity in that park, but it was the most heavily used because it gave that kind of tactile experience and that unleashing of the creativity. So that is certainly something that resonates with me.
Yeah, and I would expect something like that from Robin. He was a former IPA president as well. And here we're really using a lot of recycled, possibly waste material, things that would be considered waste materials, offcuts from maybe building processes or factories and small businesses or even the home as play resources. So they definitely also taps into questions around sustainability, environmental awareness and education, maybe circular economy. There's a connection between those things.
That's great. I want to turn our attention. We had a comment in the chat about Teresa mentioned a play policy. What does that look like? And I'm curious just how that's played out in the example that you gave. I also wanted to, and kind of related to the rights of the rights of the child and the UN efforts that, as you mentioned, the U.S. has not been a signatory yet. And it reminds me of the Paris Agreement with climate that the U.S. did not sign, but we've had local governments that have committed to the Paris Accord. And I'm wondering if there has been any movement or any possibility of looking at a similar strategy with the UN rights of the child that could our local elected officials sign on locally for something that's not happening nationally. And then kind of a follow-up to that is just hearing what's happened locally with your own experience with a play policy.
Okay. So I think I'll start at the end and come back to the beginning.
Yeah.
If that sounds like a logical way to do things.
Yeah.
So so the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, the UK has been a signatory for more than 20 years. It changes the landscape within which we are working as advocates for children. It highlights the relationships between children and adults, duties and obligations, how we are together. And our previous Children's Commissioner actually used to describe it often as a set of promises that we've made to children that we then, need to uphold. So it brings in elements of participation. Everybody has to participate in it. Children have to participate. Accountability, legality, non-discrimination, equality, all of these, empowerment. So all of these kind of factors all start to coalesce around the fact that we have this, we've taken on this set of obligations in a really positive way. I think it's a trajectory. So the UK have been a signatory for years. This year, this coming year, Scotland's going to be incorporating the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child into Scots law, directly into Scots law. So we're really happy about that. Yeah, thank you. And next year has been designated the Year of Childhood year. So I think what happens is that it doesn't just change things overnight, but it starts, you have to kind of see it as a change of culture. And there are lots of different parts that need to, lots of different bodies and agencies who need to play their part. But fundamentally, we need to have sort of some kind of understanding of children as rights holders, and that just changes relationships in a very good way. There's absolutely no reason why a state or a city can't sign up to all the principles of the Convention on the Rights of the Child and make public statements around it, set their own priorities and say how they're going to meet them and make themselves accountable. So please do go ahead and do that. I'll wait to hear what's happening in Atlanta. You can report back via our friend Cynthia. But what that doesn't do then, if it's not at a state level, because the relationship between the UN and the state is that it's the state that's reporting back to the UN committee every 4 or so years. The UN committee then sends recommendations back to the state. I'm saying the state as in the country, the whole country. in order to suggest what changes should be made or what improvements should be made in terms of sort of gradual realisation of children's rights step by step. So without the US being a signatory, then you're not part of that whole system. And that system then creates a momentum. So it means that all your NGO bodies can create their reports that go up to the UN that can influence, that might be quite, they're often called the shadow reports, that might be different from what your country is saying, might be different from the message from the White House. So yes, you don't have that formal mechanism, but I always understood advocacy as being both bottom up and top down. So when IPA, for example, lobbied really hard around Article 31, because where the right to play is embedded, because it was considered a bit of a forgotten right. It wasn't considered somehow or other rights were seen as more important, whereas all the rights in the convention are equally important. So IPA lobbied hard around this and made a change, and the UN committee did a statement called a general comment on Article 31. So what that does, it means that the UN committee is speaking directly to government and saying, this is how we expect you to be meeting your obligations in respect to Article 31, children's right to play. So you can have both that top down, but you can also have the bottom up. And I think both of those things are necessary.
Yeah, that makes an awful lot of sense. I think it's also interesting. You mentioned a play commissioner, and I could see having having a structure where there's someone who's paying attention to those types of issues could be helpful in trying to make sure that there's a receptive ear. Yeah. There was a comment that we had here from Heather Hussey-Coker, who said, how do we think about and engage children as real constituents in the park planning process and implementation? And I think it was Abigail was the one who you brought up the example that every time it feels like it should be our turn, there's somebody else. That's right. So any thoughts about the idea of trying to, and I think this relates to the idea of making Atlanta a playful city. How do we enlist and engage children in that plan so that it's something that they are not just a recipient of the process or the result, but they're actually engaged as some of the folks who are actually part of the process in the front end?
Yeah. So I'll start by just saying that the Children's Commissioner we mentioned is a commissioner who it's a specific body that has status independent of government, that holds government to account on children's rights broadly, not just on play. It'd be nice to have a play commissioner, but it's on on all of children's rights, but very important, but with an interest in children's play, clearly. And that, I think, relates to that point about Abigail and about children's involvement, because it's all about sort of starting to build up that culture that, you know, why would we be doing these things without consulting and talking to children? How can we possibly know what their experience is? What does it look like from their point of view? So again, I think there's a bit of a bottom up and top down kind of thing here. So, I mean, there's lots of different examples of ways of involving children in processes. NGOs tend to be particularly good at this. The schools, Under the Same Sky, a project that you mentioned right at the very beginning, which is also on the IPA website, has a toolkit which is related to children talking about their own experience. So I think, I mean, there's lots of different participative type of activities that we can do, but there's also that trick that you can get to where actually organizations, public bodies, government level have to do it. It's not just optional. And that's when you start to get into the, you know, are we actually legislating for this? Are there requirements in law? Do our planning laws say children have to be consulted before you make these types of decisions? So I think I like most things, there's two elements to this.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I will share that I could continue this conversation for another hour, but I do get the sense that we're at that appointed hour of 1 o'clock, and we are going to move into these breakout sessions. Before we do, number one, I wanted to just thank you for being here and being part of this conversation. It's been My mind is just buzzing with different ideas, and I think this definitely fits to a number of different ways that we can bring this work forward here in Atlanta. Any final thoughts on what we should take away from your presentation?
Well, you know, it's a trick. I had a look at my picture on the screen. I can see it getting dark around me because it's already pitch black outside here. And this wasn't originally what I was going to say, but I think because of the tone of the conversation, it's reminded me just to think about no matter what is changing around us, no matter what the circumstances around us, you know, whether we feel that we're going into darker months or more difficult months ahead of us with changes and restrictions, that, you know, play is such a fundamental thing to health and well-being that we mustn't forget that. We mustn't fall back into the trap of thinking, oh, they'll just play anyway, or it's you know, they're going to be all right. We need to remember that play is something that children really need to do in order to survive and thrive, and that we as adults have an obligation to really support that in the ways that we can, but also don't over-organize them.
Yeah. Child-centered, child-directed.
That's it.
Well, that's great. I will say at this point, this is my moment for virtual applause. Thank you so much, Teresa, for joining us today. This has been a great conversation. I wish you well in all of your efforts. I also would encourage our audience to check out the document that's been put together as direction for play in crisis for parents and for carers, that's been translated into a number of different languages and is available on the IPA website. I know we sent that out to folks beforehand, but we'll make sure to share it as well. I think that's something that folks can take back home, and it gives you a lot of useful, tangible ideas of how to make play alive in children, and again, giving them the space to kind of set their own rules and to create their own world. Thank you, Teresa.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me, and enjoy the rest of your discussions.
Thank you. So this concludes today's official program. We will be in our optional breakout sessions from here forward. So simply click on the sessions button on the left-hand side of your screen. There you'll see 3 breakout rooms that you can click to enter. Each of the breakout rooms will be focused on a different topic related to today's program. And we've outlined these topics in the chat and in the session tab. Feel free to jump around and to participate in as many as you'd like. You will receive a follow-up email next week with a satisfaction survey and links to view a recording of today's presentation. There also might be some people who you think should have seen this who weren't here, that you're welcome to spread the word and to invite them to listen to the session. This message will also include a brief quiz that can be completed to receive a CEU credit for today's program. I know we had some interest in that. So with that, I would encourage you to join the additional breakouts, or if you're going to depart, I hope you'll get some time outside with the great fall weather and spend some time playing in a park. Thank you so much for joining us for today's program. I look forward to continuing the conversation with many of you, and I hope you all have a great day and a great weekend. Thanks so much.